Okay, thank you everyone for being here. I'm really excited to facilitate this discussion with two close colleagues and friends, Leonard, Cortana and Ricado Jacobs. So first I just want to start, because we have a limited amount of time, with what were your sort of initial reactions to the documentary and how did you sort of come to learn about the story of Dulcie September?
Go ahead.
So first of all, good evening everyone. Thank you so much for being here in the screening, and I just want to have my first thought for my students and to tell them congratulations for the work that you've been doing for the podcast. This will be a very important piece for the trial, that is the beginning of the hearings, not the trial, but actually the petition to reopen the investigation. So this is a dance movie. This is going through so many different directions. The way I discovered Dulcie September was actually through the voice of the activist. In France, we have that illusion that when Mandela was released, and in 1984, when Mandela was elected president, France was all the time the friend of the revolution movement and the anti-apartheid struggle, which obviously was not true, as you can see in the movie. And even after the release of all those information, like the relationship between the French government, the arms deal, kept on going for many, many years until today. So many activists, when Dulcie September got murdered in 1988, they told me that it was for them this kind of activist coming of age, this moment where actually they realized that they wanted to do something and they really wanted to work globally. So that whole story of the anti-apartheid struggle and the collaboration between the people in exile and the French activists is something that is definitely not well known and very well publicized. So when you work on the 80s and when you work on this movement, it's important also to retrieve the work of the activist. When I was in the archive, I was so surprised that actually the main function of this activist not only was to help the people in exile, but also to go to the mainstream media and to say, you cannot speak about the apartheid as the ANC organization and all those movements as terrorists. And the idea of the reframing, of being much more precise and much more complex, because even the French media, when you go to the archive, are quite complicit with what was happening at that moment. So this is the first important movement, and I think the movie not only speaks about the fight of Dulcie September, but also speak about that complete erasure of that story within the French narrative. The second thing is obviously, as the movie said, the ANC and the legacy of the ANC in Western Europe is this boy men's club. We don't speak about the women activists, we don't speak about the black women, we don't speak also about the threat that women went through within the movement. So the movie and the struggle, the movement behind Dulcie September, the work that she's done, is also a catalyst of what we don't talk, what we put we sweep under the rug, as the activists are saying. And then finally, I want to speak about the movie. We don't think enough about the role of visual media and films in the anti-apartheid struggle. If you look at the ways activists were actually making events, they always used one movie to start. They call it the consciousness movie, with, of course, relationship to the communist movement, because they were the main partner in Europe. You have many stories of films being smuggled by train all over Europe to actually show images that were censored all over Europe. So this is important to retrieve also the story of that film as the legacy of this anti-apartheid struggle using movies. And today the story of that movie is that also it's going to serve as a visual evidence in the petition to reopen the trial. So one thing that I find important, and all the time Enver is telling me, please, you are in the US there is the tendency when you use a film to speak about a cultural context that you erase the film and straight go ahead, you just go to the story. So I just want to say something about the film, that two things that I find interesting is that the film used the only archives available of Dulcie September as a kind of a repressed memory. All those pictures that are coming back all the time, these are the only archives that are available, because in the French national country, we only have all those archives being sealed for the last 34 years. So the only archives that are available are basically the one that you have here. And obviously the whole history of all those people that carry with them the legacy of Dulcie September. Many of the people featured on screen died in the last 2-3 years, so there was an urgency as well to record all those different testimonies. But I think it's important to think that when you don't have access to anything, when the archives are completely declassified, you need to recreate archives. You need to find a way not only to spread the legacy, but if you want to call out for justice, you need an evidence to go to the trial, and you need an evidence to actually fight the complete erasure of that story. So this is why there's, Enver Samuel is not only using the film as a visual evidence, but creating a petition that I invite you to sign. When you Google Dulcie September petition, you will find it very easily online, and creating a whole study guide and a whole work behind the film to educate about that story that has been completely erased of history books.
Thank you. And a lot of what you said we'll kind of touch upon with the rest of our discussion. Ricado, how about you?
Yeah, I was thinking in 1988, I was in grade 10, and
Doing quick math there.
and we were trying to do two things: to burn down the system and throwing stones. And so, at the time, there was a lot of killings and murder of people, both young and old, and it's and interesting for me to reflect and watch the movie again as a sort of a someone said a murder mystery, but it's also about an incomplete liberation, right? And the complexity of thinking about liberation and celebrating individuals, and who is silenced and who is given prominence. So it's a good way, particularly when the archive have been destroyed, and this is a visual, as Leonard has said, a display of that trajectory of thinking about how do we deal with an incomplete liberation. So for me, it's although I'm not related to Dulcie, it's both personal and it also reflects the tensions and the struggles within South Africa, and I guess most failure of national liberation movements across the continent.
Well, just sort of building off of that, I mean, how do you each see the sort of the case of Dulcie September being evoked in contemporary anti-racist activism and other prior activist movements?
So there's many things. I mean, obviously in the case of complete erasure, for instance, of the women activists for the ANC in the movement, she's representing an intersectional voice, she's representing portraits that are not being, as you were saying, in that national liberation, have been completely removed. I'm thinking in South Africa, for instance, in the student movement, she's been used and she's being used as a platform to speak about how incomplete are the history curriculums, for instance, both in South Africa, and I can speak about France because this is a country where I grew up, and we never speak about the anti-apartheid movement. We always glorify somehow just Nelson Mandela and the release, but we don't want to go more complex around that story. So she's bringing with her not only the story of this movement, but she's also bringing the question of becoming a political prisoner, being banned, going on exile, which I think the movie does also a very good work. What is being on exile, which kind of family, political family you find when you're on exile, which kind of political advocacy you can find. And even more than that, the question of Dulcie September, when you go to the archives, it's always the same story. She had to go and to testify all over France to actually repeat all the time the same thing. The ANC should be recognized as a movement of liberation and not a terrorist movement. And she was tirelessly going all over the country, even going to Switzerland and Belgium, because she was representing all those countries. And I think she represented a thread in that way, because what I consider as an activist are two things. The first thing is a community organizer. And I think it's said in the movie, every time she was called upon, she was going even to the smallest village, because she thought that one voice could change everything. Which explained today that in more than 40 cities in France, you have her name, being a square, being a school, being a center, because she decided to meet the factory workers who maybe will never do much around the struggle, but at least will be conscientized and will have some kind of impact around the work that she's doing. The second thing is where she was very good at bringing both past, present, and future. She really envisioned a future, but she was like, we have to keep the historic legacies. And I do think that if she was alive after the liberation, after the liberation of South Africa, the country, she would have criticized some of the movements of the ANC. She would have created that complex voice that maybe at the moment of the end of the Cold War, when we wanted to have a new country, she would have been a very complicated voice. And so in this activism, the new voices that are coming up, both in South Africa and I think in Europe, using the anti-apartheid struggle as an example of a global activism, is to make things complex. We tend to glorify, we tend to elevate voices because this is a way of celebrating a victory, but we shouldn't see activism above all as an atavistic kind of strategy. It's always complex, and by making it more complex, we are going to educate the future generation how to make good activism. And it's also very important, maybe just today something that we have to keep in mind, she was murdered because she was married to the cause. And when I see, because I'm studying activism in my dissertation and in my research, how much we glorify and sometimes we make glamour activists all over the world, we also have to remember that this is what is happening. Today, according to the Human Rights Defender report, almost one person every day is being killed as an activist for bringing issues, mainly indigenous today and anti-arms deal still, activists are being murdered. So it's important also to question all those networks of private sector political powers that still kill activists today.
Yeah, one of the things you had also brought up when we talked about this earlier was the sort of point around her being a woman. So I wonder if you had to just sort of say a few words about the gender aspect of this as well.
So obviously in terms of research and as being a cis man, it's very important for me to address the paternalism that she went through and the machism within the party, within the French territory, the fact that she's constantly, when she goes to the French authorities, or even when she tries to call the ANC movement, she's just being said, you're hysterical, or you shouldn't be taken seriously. There is something that is incredible in that story to think that being a soft target and being one of the highest ranked ANC member outside of Africa and having so little protection, I mean, this is just insane. And it shows how much, once she had to be a target, because at one moment she could have been protected, and I could never believe that the French intelligence would have no way to know that she would be killed. I was talking to a professor at Columbia researching about Malcolm X, and already in 1965, Malcolm X, the CIA wanted to kill Malcolm X in France, and France were like, oh, don't do that here. So if they were able to do that in 1965, how come in 1988? I mean, this is just completely impossible. The whole story that you can read in the book of Evelyn, of the meeting in the airport, and all those different things are just collaborating the idea that clearly there was a collaboration between both countries. So that question of being a woman in the movement also is bringing the question, how can you erase and how can you silence? Because she was not afraid and she was fighting everyone because she just wanted the truth of it. Last thing that is also important, and it's important for me to say that, when you're a woman activist, you're usually being remembered as a face of the movement. And I think that the movie tries to bring back also the idea that she worked tirelessly. She brings so much intellectual production. The work, and this is why she became so threatening, is that she stumbled upon something that was murderous for her. And this is not what we remember usually for women activists. We remember that they are community organizers. We remember that they were good with children. And this is the picture that you will find in the archives in France. Oh yes, she was talking in the market with people. She went to this place, she went to the feminist place. Even the feminist organization at that time were speaking about her eyes, her clothes, but never about intellectual production. So it's maybe time that we create methodology, and when we speak about women activism, we also go to the roots, the work that they were able to do, because they were also mostly in France, from what I know, not being taken seriously. So this was a way for her actually to go very, very far in her research.
Ricado, what do you see as the connections between Dulcie September and present and historical activism?
Yeah, I think one has to locate Dulcie September within 3 periods. And I think prior to joining the ANC, she was part of this group. And I see her as a revolutionary and as an intellectual. And the importance of the people that she associated at that historical moment, the unity movement or the non-European unity movement, where the key issue was principled struggle. Right? And I think that is the key lesson that one can take from Dulcie September, even being incarcerated and continue on a principled basis, continuing the struggle. And you can see it through what she's investigating, and that is not to engage in this form of performative politics, but what is guiding you. And I think her approach, even joining the ANC, and this sounds funny, that I think she continued to be anti-capitalist in her orientation. And because one think about the people that were murdered in this brutal way was the people who were not satisfied with the path towards democracy and who could anticipate where this whole project was going. And I think that is the continuation between activism today and particularly women. The key thing with our democracy, and just not in South Africa, but I think in the whole of the continent, it is difficult to think about who are the women protagonists. of history of the liberation movement. And I think the film in that sense is allowing us to have a reckoning and to say, what was the contribution of people as a whole to the struggle, not just in terms of being anti-apartheid activists, but also intellectual contribution and a revolutionary contribution. And I think that is where I would locate Dulcie September, but also in the current conjuncture about engaging in principled struggles and to understand what is it that we are struggling against, Was it the struggle against apartheid, or was it against the whole system of capitalism that has subjected people and continues to do this under new guise within, I guess on a global scale, but particularly South Africa as well.
The other thing one of the other things that the film opens up is the connections between France and South Africa, and specifically, this connection to racism and colonialism in France, and particularly the political context. And so, I don't know if you can say a little bit about that.
So something that is interesting in the connection that Dulcie had, and I can think first about the lawyer, for instance, that they hired in 2000. She was someone working for the FLN in the national liberation, the Algerian War. So all those connections, all those activists she was working with, they were already struggling from the 60s to the 80s to have actually the truth coming out about what happened in Algeria and all this colonial legacy. Mm-hmm. So there is something important to know in the 70s, in the 80s, and the stories will be different in the US, but in France we never speak about South Africa and I would say Africa in general. Mm-hmm. So the work of the activists was not only to actually fight and help the people in exile, but actually to rewrite a story, because unfortunately who was writing the story in France at the time? The far-right politics. Right. In the archives, what I can find very easily at the time are all the right-wingers speaking about how much the regime of Betrayal was so strong and so good in the way that they were working, without very much having no one reflecting about, because there was no interest whatsoever. Mm-hmm. So they also wanted to really fight against all those theories, and they've been creating a lot of post-colonial theory already. The 80s is a moment where the anti-racist movement, we have this huge march, as we call in 1983, for the equality in France. So that collision, right, of this moment where finally all those different things are opening up, because also the 80s is a moment where television, where media are extremely moving up very quickly, when finally those images are coming up. Because until the 70s, 80s, we don't have any images whatsoever coming. So 1976 is in South Africa, the Soweto uprising, mm-hmm. and this has been a huge impact all over the world. 1977, this is the United Nations sanction. So finally we arrive in the 80s. So Dulcie arrives at a moment in France where the conversation is a little bit opening up. The left comes to power in 1981. Finally we have a Ministry of Women Equality. So people don't know why Dulcie was appointed. She didn't speak any French, which is a huge issue when you arrive in French, even more at the time in the 80s. But I think she was representing somehow the voice of someone who wouldn't make any compromise mm-hmm. and bring that question. So in terms of collaboration, she created very strong intellectual links, and she was also producing and helping the production of that narrative. Clearly, France today, to come a little bit to where we are, we have a backlash around reflecting post-colonial issues. We are sitting 2 days after the mm-hmm. election, the result of the presidential election, when we have two candidates that overtly are against any post-colonial studies and race studies. And even Emmanuel Macron, the president, have opened in the parliamentary a whole commission against wokeism, knowing and saying that most of the studies trying to reflect about the role of France in post-colonial stories should be completely erased, and we shouldn't speak about that. Most of the candidates coming up to the TV and the news channel are saying that colonization was not a crime against humanity. Mm-hmm. So we are dealing with a lot of issues, and when the story of Dulcie is coming and is telling through an exterior gaze, mm-hmm. which is not a complete French gaze, but through the story of South Africa, and is revealing how France was also complicit with what was happening, this becomes quite strong, because French people cannot step back and say, we didn't do anything. Mm-hmm. I never heard anything similar in terms of speaking openly about arms trade in the context of the 80s in France. So this is a whole story that we have to create. And then I think finally, I just want to bring the question of Marine Le Pen, who is the candidate, and she's in the second round. And obviously, even if she tries to clean the party and to bring a new image, it's important to remember that her father, who was the founder of the Front National, which is the extreme right party, published the direction the postal address of Dulcie September, and openly had a war against her. And so many activists that I could study in the long period of the 80s. So even if she tried to clean the party, those people that he worked with are still working with her. So that legacy of that party that always attacked people who tried to fight against racial inequality and the struggle for freedom, this is the story that we have today. So I think it's also very important to read that story not only through 1988 or the long 80s, but 2022 and where we are sitting today.
Right. Yeah. Sorry.
So I think one of the linkages is, if you think about this, I'm just rephrasing it. If you scratch a social democrat and a neo-colonial fascist bleed, because it reveals the impulse to always link right-wing ideology with the way in which things are linked. But here you had social democrats and the collaboration, and so we have to interrogate the logic of accumulation. It doesn't care if it's neo-Nazis or social democrat, its logic is still to accumulate. And I think this is the important point about during the crisis of the 1980s in South Africa, and you had a pre-revolutionary moment, but the economic ways of operation continued through the credit system, through the banks in Europe, so that continued, even though you had the so-called sanctions of the anti-apartheid movement, but the economy was still going on through that connection, you know. So this is for me the important point that one also have to consider, thinking about contemporary movements around the world, that you're calling for sanctions and divestment, but the logic, the way in which you can think about on the global, I almost want to call it a white power structure, but that is too simplistic. But the logic of global capitalism in how it operates, it doesn't care, you know. It's embedded in its logic of accumulation to even support a fascist government like the South African government, you know, because it's tied to the processes of accumulation. And I think that brings the logic between racism and capital accumulation is always tied, right? And I think that was the cardinal sin of Dulcie September, that she made that connection and paid the price for that, you know, to expose, you know, the logic of and the hypocrisy of the whole system. And it's not restricted to France. Or you can go to the US, the Israelis who supported nuclear capabilities with the South African state. So it's a whole broader system that one has to interrogate. And I think this is the beauty of the Dulcie September movie. It allows us to interrogate and pursue these lines of inquiry and to say, yes, this is it. People who preach about democracy, but, you know, supporting basically Nazis, you know.
So moving on from sort of building off of that, I wonder if we could take a minute to talk specifically about the question of violence, how it's portrayed in the documentary, but also sort of the sort of intimacy, for lack of a better word, of the assassination of Dulcie September amid the sort of, you know, quotidian nature of violence during apartheid South Africa.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this notion of violence, and I was struck by I think one of the protagonists said it is not a lover's quarrel, but there was this intimacy and the brutality of the violence. You know, it was not just to eliminate, but it was not just to silence, but it was to eliminate. You know, the whole process of Dulcie September, of exposing this particular crime. But there's something more important, and I think one have to get to this point in the discussion, the linkages between the French state, the apartheid government, and the liberation movement, and the logics of collaboration between these three, right? So the unfinished business in the South African context is that a lot of the people, or some of the people in the ANC, were known people to collaborate with the system. And so there is this personal connection in the way in which this whole thing was orchestrated. I mean, I don't want to get into conspiracy theories, but the film lends itself to that interpretation, and internally that is the logic, right? And because the archives were destroyed by the state and by the Mandela government, we will never know. So there is always question marks around people's heads about who were the collaborators. And later, information revealed that the person that replaced Dulcie September, Solly Smith, actually was an operative of, collaborated with the South African government, who was the ANC person replacing Dulcie. So you can see what is unfolding here. And I think that is the big thing that we also have to interrogate, you know, what we call the Askaris within the movements, you know.
Yeah, so just to go back to Solly Smith, it's very important to think that that double agent was actually the legacy of Dulcie September. So that the whole thing about orchestrating someone coming and claiming Dulcie September's legacy, and I've seen like some TV report about him speaking about that. You just think about that whole theatricality, right? When actually people can come in that game and can perform, right, Dulcie September, and he was like a drunkard. I mean, there's a whole thing about that, the end of the 80s and the people coming to the ANC that is very interesting to research. Another violence that I want to bring, obviously France is very much connected to assassinating activists and political power and figures in Africa. In 1888, there was like the murders of different activists in New Caledonia as well, because we also have like territories, colonial territories at that time that had like movements. I don't want to say uprising, maybe it's not the right term, but movements as well. So there is that, but there is another thing that I think it's also very important in terms of violence that resonates very much today with so many countries. I work on Brazil as well, is the question of misinformation. When Dulcie September was assassinated, there was a huge spread of misinformation. That's why usually you kill actually activists very close to election. First, because it's a wake-up call and you want to intimidate the progressive kind of forces. But it's also a moment where you have a lot of rumors coming in because it's election and manipulation of ideas. And today it's online. Before it was on newspaper and television. But at the time when she got murdered, the whole misinformation was just 3 different theories. The first one, the normal thing with women, like at the time and until today, the romantic kind of thing, which was ridiculous. The second thing was also that she was a spy for the US and she was killed by the CIA. You had to be very creative to create this kind of narrative. And then the other narrative was like, she was colored, she was not black, so she was actually killed by black ANC activists. So, you know, the whole, and of course, like that went. The other controversy was about who was actually claiming the legacy during the funeral. And the difference between England and France is that the anti-apartheid movement and struggle was very fragmented. So the socialists, the anti-racist movement, and the communists didn't really work along very, very well. So the whole thing about the funeral was not about her, but was actually the whole controversy about why the Communist Party is actually claiming her legacy. And so erasing her, also part of that misinformation that was like so strong at the time. The fact that after 4 years, everything was just sealed. And today, the reason why the family, the relatives, and the activists are just petitioning to reopen the trial is that they finally find a way to fight prescription. Because this is the tool that the French government and court is using, prescription, so you cannot do anything else afterwards. So for me, this movie is a hope. Because this movie definitely inscribed itself in that legacy of how a community of people, a global community, because that story is global, it first belonged to South Africa, it's very important, but for us in France wanted to make it more complex and to fight with that, to decolonize that idea that France was such a great country with South Africa. We finally are able to not rewrite a history, but actually to make it more complex. It's very small, but it's still a very strong beginning. So I think that we should take very seriously that whole misinformation that lasted for so many years and contributed to the violence of that crime.
And just to touch on that, I mean, there also is the misinformation about the refusal of police protection. So can you just say a few words about that as well? You mentioned that.
Yeah, so that moment, that was what we call la cohabitation. So we had the left and the right at the same time. And you're absolutely right, first, when you say that the left and right, that divide should be questioned in that question of supporting the regime. So first, but it's true that at the time, the Ministry of the Transport and the Police Security said that they never received any application for Dulcie police security, which is also like ridiculous, because if people were fighting nicely that story, you cannot expect that someone so high ranked traveling all over France and Europe shouldn't receive any police protection. I mean, this is just the madness of that story as well. When you look at the space, also like the fact that she was really a soft target, how can you create a routine when you have painters coming to that space? I mean, I don't want to go to that murder story. I think the movie does it very well, but the complete lack of protection, right. the complete assuming that someone like her should be like a kind of normal citizen and not being taken more seriously is showing already how much actually the French state was stepping and taking distance to protecting her. So that whole story was terrible, because people were silenced from the activist movement, the people who went with her to ask for the police. At the time, it was just like newspaper and TV, so basically you just hear the ministry or the government say, that never happened, that never happened. And I went through the archive and all the TV newsreel, and until maybe 2 years or 3 years afterwards, like no one else was just questioned, because the most important was to win the election. So all those questions, there is one thing that for me will always remain the huge question as well, is how come the ANC didn't come to see her? And once again, I'm not in that conspiracy theory, but it was so clear that for the last 6 months she discovered something really big, and she was crying for help. And she was someone who never cried for help. You can find some writing, and she was saying, like, I know something can happen to me. She was hosted in a home, in a house close to a school, and she asked to be moved to another place because she was afraid that when she's going to be killed, children would be killed. So that was for the last 3 years that she knew that something like that could happen. But the complete lack of protection also from the ANC movement is a big mystery for me. And without going into conspiracy theory, I just cannot understand that someone so high ranked wouldn't have that kind of protection.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
Look, I don't want to detract from Dulcie September, but I think to discuss the ANC as the only movement in South Africa is itself problematic, you know, and the movie sort of perpetuates that myth that they are the representatives of the people of South Africa. They're but one, right? And so I think what the movie does, and I think where Dulcie September is moving towards, is to interrogate the legacy of the ANC. So you ask yourself, here's your member, you are in power like 24 or more years, why don't you drive the investigation into the murder of Dulcie September? So that's the question that we should ask. And it comes back to, if Dulcie September become an iconic figure like Nelson Mandela or anyone else, you have to explain, why was she murdered? It would be, every year you would have to celebrate, and it would force the public to reckon with why was she murdered? And we could see the continuation between the arms deal of the 80s with the apartheid government and the current ANC government that continued. And so it's a question of the betrayal, not just of Dulcie September, and then I want to come back to my early point, but it's a betrayal of the liberation of people in South Africa, and that they bought into this project, this neoliberal project. And I think Dulcie September was like a hindrance to the shift towards this neoliberal project, because she would have disrupted that. So there was a smooth continuation between the Nazi government in South Africa and then the new so-called liberators, right? And so this is what is exposed, you know, the myth of liberation, and you know, the idea that this was a liberation movement, right? It questions its logic, because there are more things. They met with the capital and business in the 1980s, and so this is the point that is exposed. But it's also exposed this idea that France is the bastion of liberty. I think it's an interesting idea, but right, and that is not there. You know, I mean, you can think about, from Thomas Sankara to the long history in the continent. It's just still a new colonial force, and the type of violence that it is still unleashing in Mali and all of this. And so you can see that continuation and link it, the ANC's legacy within the continent. You know, if you think about that they are the conduit for capital in the 21st century, that is how money is channeled through Johannesburg to the rest of the world. So they are playing a very interesting role in the contemporary conjuncture. And I think had that exposure happened, it would have been a complete different dynamic, because more people would have questioned internally, to say, okay, what is this? And so there's a longer story about the continuation, and basically, it's just a story of betrayal. Not just the murder of Dulcie September, but also the idea of liberation and freedom and the distribution of resource and to create a new society, And so that promise have just evaporated, and I think this is the legacy that we have to interrogate.
Yeah, and relatedly to what you just said, I mean, one of the things we talked about earlier was also the way that sort of the erasure of the archives was crucial to sort of creating this narrative. So I wonder if we can just draw that a little bit further.
Yeah, and it's interesting that the ANC sort of managed that process. That too, I mean, there's a theory that about almost 40 tons of material were destroyed. And willingly, without any intervention, even by hand, through furnaces. And so the dilemma that the movie also exposes is that all of that knowledge has disappeared, and we don't have access to it in South Africa. But it exists somewhere else, because there were ties. Because the apartheid state was not operating on its own, right? It was a white bastion within a broad geopolitical, and this might sound controversial, it was Israel of the Middle East, right? And so it fulfills that role because it is allowed to produce nuclear capabilities and all of that, and I think the stakes are much higher, right? And if it would have exposed, I think a lot of people inside the ANC would have also been exposed. And so there was a trade-off, like, do we make it available and we can get the perpetrators of the crimes and convict them, but what about those who collaborated?
Right.
Right, and I think that is the interesting thing that the movie also, subtle and sometimes not in so subtle ways, is exposing. It was interesting, Aziz Pahad's response. Did I really say that? It was like a funny moment, like, oh, okay.
Yeah. Do you have anything to?
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly the same story. So as I was saying, it's been sealed for 34 years. The activists that I could interview at the time, they were all very angry because they were like, how come we didn't find a way to run to her apartment? And everything was stolen. Stolen, that's the right word, actually. And the family today know that they won't know during their lifetime who killed or who ordered the murder, but at least want to know what she found. The diary that she was writing, the whole information. How can a family grieve and 34 years afterwards without having access to her production? So, that in France you have two ways. You have different status of the archives. You have secret and top secret. So both of the archives that are spread in 3 different spaces, ministries, are secret and top secret. So that tells you already what you are saying. Like, we are in a very, very high standard kind of archive. But I also want to try to stay positive a little bit and to see actually how the work of some people to try to dive and to be more speculative and to create different archives is also important today. That rewriting of that story, that ways of, scratching, you use that word, I think, scratching, creating those archives. And the movie does that. The voiceover that you have in the movie is actually a play that has been created out of the life of Dulcie September and has been played as well. So all those, the role of theater, the role of art, the role of media and journalism, it's also important because
Countering that erasure.
Yes, yeah. And I do think that we have really no clue what we would be able to find. I think maybe the movie plays a little bit with this idea that we kind of know. I think it's much more complex than that. But it's true that the way the movies retrieve all these works from so different actresses and actors to create a counter-memory. And the thing that you can see online as well, all the digital visual activism around her life, should be seen and should be understood and should be treated at least as a first effort to unerase her. So I try to stay a little bit positive about that, because Open Secrets, for instance, Annie Van Haren, that you see that wrote that amazing book, if you're interested in that story about the gun, the arms and the money, had a podcast on Dulcie September, just Who Killed Dulcie. It's a 6-episode podcast. They have an extra one, 7, and they do an amazing work with the little archive that they have, that they could find in South Africa. So there is work being produced very much in the country right now, with different voices, with different people, a lot of women working to unerase the role of women also as well. So we should also be optimistic about that. There is a movement. But definitely the day we are going to decolonize and declassify those archives, there will be a big win, because this is what the family needs, and the country, I guess, as well. This is history.
Right. Yeah, and so I want to come maybe towards the end. There's a lot of clips of the sort of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the aftermath of that, and then also maybe tie that into the kind of the current status of the Justice for Dulcie campaign.
I have very specific, I think the Truth and Reconciliation Commission did not achieve its objective, because the assumption is that you are talking to human beings, right? You have to, because that assumption, the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, showed that we are not engaging with human beings. You have to be human to say, yeah, I committed this, but that process has never been there. And so the perpetrators, the logic of Mandela to assume is talking to human beings, right? And so they haven't discovered the humanity. And so that is the basic injustice of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because the rights of the victims have been completely taken away. Right? So you could go there and go and confess, even on the murder of Dulcie September. What is much more interesting, the former minister, Puk Botha, became a member of the ANC. Yeah. So you see this system and the way in which it happens. So I'm very critical of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Even the people, the victims, up to date have not been compensated. A mere pittance. Right, it's not even a lot of money, and so you can think about reparations in that sense. There's the logic of the family that they need justice, but I think one have to tie Dulcie to the broader South African family, and that she should represent justice for the entire society, because there are a lot of people that this injustice is just continuing because of the way in which society is structured, And it was more of the victims going and bearing their souls, and some of them even laughing. Some of these perpetrators, you can think about their level of humanity, that you can murder activists, burn their bodies, and on the other side have a barbecue, right? And then you go there and still go and ridicule the victim. So for me is that this is the realm of non-human beings, that we have to find a way. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission should have achieved 2 purposes: to restore the humanity of those oppressed, but also the oppressor, but also to do redistribution in society and change the structure of the economy and social relations in society more broadly. And I think that objective has been lost. And I think this is what the Dulcie September and the activism should continue to do. And I think that is the broader context in which one should locate this incomplete struggle.
So as a non-South African, I can just, one thing that for me is important in that restorative justice process, at least it's true that what the TRC has done has been a huge broadcasting in South Africa, outside of the country. So it's been a source of archive, obviously, of those stories. I completely agree with you, and I think that in the line of Dulcie September, TRC without reparation is just a failure. But it's hard for me to say in terms of positionality, but what we see, and the last discourse, for instance, that French activists have read in front of the embassy like several weeks before she got murdered, were all about that the regime of Betrayal was Nazi, that it's time to think about reparation, that there was already in 1988 that feeling that, yes, we are going to move forward, but we cannot move forward without thinking about, as you said, redistribution and reparation. So the case of Dulcie in that sense is an unresolved case. The GRC had more than 300 in unresolved case, in addition to the people who didn't come to testify in the court. So I completely agree with that. One thing that is important for me to say, I think we are arriving toward the end, September is also a name of an enslaved person. She was holding the name of an enslaved person. So Dulcie September, her story and her ancestors are also representing that legacy of reparation, needs for reparation. So clearly there is a symbol that shouldn't be erased, and sometimes I also try to bring justice for Dulcie, but justice for Dulcie September, because it's important to bring also that question. And to answer your question around the campaign, I think what the French has done to delay the process has been really hard for Enver, because Enver was the only one trying to raise money with the Justice for Dulcie campaign. Obviously, when it's being completely delayed, you cannot pay anymore the people, the community manager, the people behind. Something that is important is that Dulcie was murdered pre-internet, so basically you have everything to build in terms of digital persona, in terms of digital networks, which kind of images you want to use, which kind of archives you want to put. So it was a lot of work, and people were working like part-time to full-time to the campaign. They also created a conversation within the schools, because there is a huge issue in school curriculum in South Africa. So the movie can be used as a platform, and people came to the Q&As, it became a political forum. You had the crime perpetrators, the people who were victimized by the system, who had a meeting there, and the nephew, Michael, that you see in the movie was one of the hosts of those Q&As, for instance, in the school, and many of the people working with. So it's important to think, and this is what I try to say in my research, those stories are methodology as well. Methodology to declassify the archive, to declassify the knowledge, to make complex all the things that have happened. And Dulcie is a beautiful platform for that. Dulcie September is a beautiful platform for that. So hopefully there will be some advances. I doubt that it will come from the French side. I have more hope that something will happen on the South African side, but at least if we have a chance as a global audience to put pressure, to show the movie, to raise awareness, to do like my students, like production, to speak about her, believe me, this is pressure. Because for the moment, the French, as much as the South African, they have the power to erase her because she didn't exist enough in the mediascape in both countries. So I think that the small role that we're having tonight and the production that we have, the Q&As, the whole thing that we can create, it's a small step, but this is a step necessary to make her exist and to give her justice.
Okay, I think we're at time. So thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Leonard and Ricado, for this fantastic conversation.